Forged on the gridiron in September. Perfected in the magic of March. For the fans who love the crunch of the pads. Prefer a dunk. And expect nothing but the best. This was the Big Ten. Now this is Bigger Ten. Here's Steve Dace.
Indeed, it is time for Bigger Ten, and we actually have Big Ten games to talk about. 18 of them. In fact, our good friend, partner, no, co-host, never partner, the one and only Aaron McIntyre. Stoic as always, my friend. How are you?
Doing all right. I had a surprise for you planned for the top of the show, but I figure I already gave you enough absolute crap, although I don't think it's crap, about the sorry state of the At Michigan Podcast X account. I had a surprise for you, but during our day jobs, I already gave you enough crap in front of a lot more people than what watch this show. So I think we're good now.
What's funny about this is I actually think I'm handling this pretty well. I mean, we just won the Natty. I'm pretty restrained. I'm good.
It's that right there. Will
No
Johnson
self-awareness
just missed another coverage assignment, but it's okay. We won the Natty. Oh, he just got a pick six. It's okay. We still won the Natty. We don't have a quarterback. We still won the Natty. It's just, I can't. I just can't.
Is that passive aggressive enough for you, or?
It's that. This is what I was going to do, but I feel like I've already given you enough crap. It would have just been mean-spirited at this point. Although that's never stopped either of us from.
Why does that stop?
I was just going to Photoshop. Exactly. I was going to Photoshop the Michigan Podcast X profile and rename it Unhinged Psychobabble. That's what I was going to do.
Nice.
But I figured at this point.
Based on what I think is going to happen this weekend, you definitely want to have me muted, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Oh, it's already done. Yeah.
Anyway, let's. What a team this makes. I can't stand you. All right, let's get to it. Let's get to the Big Five topics on Bigger Ten. Let's start with the statement that Penn State made in Morgantown, West Virginia. And, hey, I mean, the Nittany Lions were an 8-point favorite in this game. So they were expected to win somewhat comfortably, but they won this convincingly. And it's also, though, the way that they won it, right? I mean, I go back to the Big Ten camp report or the BTN camp report from Penn State. Jerry DiNardo said, this looks like every other Penn State we've seen. That did not look like every other Penn State team that we have seen on Saturday. I mean, guys are open in space. Andy Kotelnicki, the new OC from Kansas, scheming guys like way the F open, as the kids say today. Okay. Drew Aller just hosing throws down the field. The touch pass that he threw in the corner of the end zone for a touchdown right before half might have been the best throw I saw any Big Ten quarterback make this weekend. And there was some good quarterback play in this league. We'll talk about Miller Moss here in a second, for example. You had Dylan Gabriel throwing for like 7,000 yards. But that was not the Drew Aller that we saw last year. On top of it, Aaron, they had a 3-hour weather delay.
Yes.
And, you're sitting there in the visitor locker room where you don't have the best facilities.
That cannot be understated.
You come right out and put it right on them. I don't know, man. I as a James Franklin skeptic, I thought that was a statement that Penn State made on Saturday.
And this is not a bad West Virginia team, we don't think, at all. And I don't think it can be, overstated. The enormous weather delay that they went through. I mean, I can't imagine sitting there for 3 hours. Probably they spilled out into the tunnel. I have to think so. But to come back out and play with the same level of intensity and domination as they did, really, really impressive win for Penn State. I was expecting, and I think Vegas was expecting a much closer game given the point spread. It was still
bet way down.
It was still a 2-possession point spread. But at the same time, I think Vegas was expecting something else, and Penn State delivered something else indeed. So hats off to James Franklin. Really good start. And that's really important for Drew Aller as well. Going in on the road, hitting guys in space, for that guy's confidence, I have to think it's going through the roof right now.
And I know what, other fellow James Franklin skeptics are saying. Well, first of all, come back to me when you do that against Ohio State or Michigan. So, yeah, check that box, or that box still needs to be checked. But, well, this looked like when they went down to Auburn a couple of years ago and beat them, or they beat the same West Virginia team really bad at home. Again, the scores may have been similar, guys, but the style of football being played was not. I mean, there was a noticeable difference in big play creation and offensive aggression from this Penn State team than we had previously seen. So let's make a note of that moving forward. I talk about other teams making statements. Let's talk about the venerable Big Ten brand known as USC. I still am not ready for this. Did you see what Lincoln Riley said after the game? I mean, what are your thoughts on this big win? He goes, it's a nice win for Big Ten football. I mean, he doesn't get it either. Yeah. Okay. But Miller Moss, I was skeptical. He had one game, and it was in a bowl game against a Louisville team who had just had its heart ripped out at the end of its year and didn't want to be there. And USC didn't know what it had either. It was absolutely in the transfer portal trying to get Cam Ward and some of these guys. Then Miller Moss went out there and threw for 6 touchdowns, and they just said, we'll go with what we got. Well, he was phenomenal against LSU. And the guy on the other side, Garrett Nussmeier, was pretty good too. Incredible game. USC, what I liked the most, and I know LSU defensively has not been good the last few years, but we do know they have one of the better offensive lines in college football. There's at least 2 first-round draft picks on that line right now. And the defensive front stood up to the running game. It's not so much that USC won. I mean, that was nice enough. But I think if USC had won this like 41-38, we would not have been necessarily that surprised. But they won a game here in the low 20s where much of this was played in a phone booth, which bodes well for them, I think, moving forward the rest of the season with the new league that they're in.
Agreed. And I think you retweeted this. I can't remember who actually tweeted it to begin with. I think you retweeted this from the Bigger Ten account. The SEC went 1-3 in marquee games in week 1.
Danny
That's
Kanell at CBS Sports
something that ESPN you're not going to see over there. But man, I couldn't have been more impressed right out the gate. I think Lincoln Riley, that's another statement. Hey, I can coach quarterbacks. I can actually coach a team. Their defense, as you alluded to, looked really, really improved. Again, Jerry DiNardo said on the BTN bus tour that the defense was behind the offense. Well, we understand that because offensively, they're really good. They're really, really good. So huge win for the Big Ten going up against what should be a pretty good LSU squad. And I can't say enough about Miller Moss, I should say. Going up and down the field. Yeah, they got stopped a few times. Yeah, there were some disappointing things, but at the end of the day, they did what they needed to do. They did what they needed to do in crunch time. And that's a lot more than you can say at this level of play. Even, they were 2 high-level teams. That was some high-level football that we saw there. Something as Iowa fans that I'm not accustomed to seeing. There were multiple times I looked up and said, whoa, that guy's really fast. It was a high-level game of football. But they executed when they absolutely had to at the end of the game, and I could not be more impressed with USC. I didn't really totally know what to expect of this team going into the season. I don't think a lot of people did, but they have to be considered towards the upper half of the Big Ten now. And yet they were there. That was where their preseason ranking was. But I do think after 1 week, I don't think it's overreacting to say that they are legit, because that was a high level of football. You could just see from the eye test. I know that's a buzz phrase that people don't like, but from the eye test, that was some high level football being played on Sunday night.
And it's replicatable, meaning that is if you can bottle that is how you can win in our league. Playing, they're always going to be a little flashier than the typical Big Ten brand. That's just who they've always been, going back to before I was even born. But that there's enough substance in the way that they won that game that can work in our league. You're not out of place in our conference playing that way.
Yeah, and I appreciated Kirk Herbstreit. God bless him. But Kirk Herbstreit, a couple of times during the broadcast, pointed out how both of those quarterbacks in that game were not journeymen, but they were loyal to their schools, and how that matters in situations like that. I think Kirk deserves some props for pointing that out too.
Yep, that was a good point that he made as well. All right, let's get to the reigning champs. All right, we have the 3-time undisputed reigning Big Ten champion And on the surface, Fresno State is one of probably them and Boise State are the two best group of 5 programs in the last 30 years of college football. They have a lot of history of beating power conference schools. They just went on the road and beat Purdue a year ago. They shut out UCLA at the end of last year. So they technically had 2 Big Ten wins a year ago. And the spread was 20, and Michigan won, or the closing spread was, and Michigan won by 20, right? So on the surface, if you didn't watch the game, what's the big deal? If you watch the game, though, it was very clear. The numbers already said this was the case, but it was very clear Michigan is starting completely over on offense. I do think there's just, too many talented players there for them not to get better as the season goes on. The problem that Michigan has is, at least right now anyway, maybe that they'll develop somebody over the course of the season, Aaron, but right now it's pretty clear they don't have a playable quarterback. If you look at the way Michigan recruited the transfer portal and built its team, it was not for Davis Warren to go out there and be a pocket passer. They thought Alex Orji was going to be a Terrell Pryor, not necessarily that level of player, but that style of quarterback that would complement their defense by running the ball a lot, occupying the clock. It's pretty obvious after 30 practices in the spring and summer combined, and he couldn't beat out a former walk-on, that he's just not playable at quarterback. And so now they're kind of trying to, patch this thing together. Well, the problem is that USC team we just talked about, they play them in 2 weeks. They play Washington, who's back in the top 25 here in 4 weeks. And this week they play Texas. So you're talking about 3 of their next 5 games are against probably 2 NFL quarterbacks and Ewers and Moss, at least guys that'll get drafted. And Washington's quarterback is still the all-time leading passer in the history of the Southeastern Conference, which means you can play really good defense and be giving up 24 points in those games. Can your offense score 25, 28? I'm really dubious about. I think it's. I'm not being whiny. I'm being analytical. I think the odds are much higher. Michigan's going to be 3-3 at the halfway point than 6-0. Okay. Now, that all being said, as a fan, I put my fan hat back on. We won the Natty. Hard to be great so many years in a row. Sooner or later, the check comes due, and at least on offense anyway, it looks like that bill is going to be a doozy. But what are your thoughts? I
think it was midway through the third quarter. I'm like, why am I sweating out over 32.5 on a monster teaser for this game? I'm like, why aren't you just letting Alex Orji in there for a full series, or at least half of a series, so he can get some snaps under his belt? And then they, right after I thought that, they let him out there for I think 2 or 3 plays in a row. And on the second or third play, he passes to the far boundary and puts it 5 yards in the ground in front of his receiver. I'm like, oh. That's why. So, as an Iowa fan, we've been in this situation for 3 years running. We think maybe we're out of it now. So I get it. When you don't have a quarterback, as Jerry DiNardo said, you don't have a team. And going back to Jake Butt's comments on the BTN bus tour, which you pointed out at Michigan Podcast on X back when I still had them unmuted, and he came back at you over them. The commentary about the quarterback play, I think that was probably a little bit more on the nose than Jake maybe wanted it to be. But I think that through one game, that's come to fruition. So, Michigan, they have virtually the same type of roster. They had just a little bit less depth than they had last year. The difference, however, as you pointed out, is the schedule. They don't really have time to develop guys to the level that they need them to be by the time these big games get here. So I think more than last week, this week is probably going to be more of the Rosetta Stone for this team than week one. You've got your typical week one problems. This week against Texas, a real big challenge. How do these guys respond? And so that's going to be more instructive, I think, for what this team can be than what you saw last week.
Let's go to topic 4. And there were some really impressive Big Ten openers this week. Iowa, with the offensive explosion it had, its best offensive game in 3-4 years. One of the best games Cade McNamara has ever played in college football. Illinois had the biggest, in terms of margin of victory, its biggest season opening shutout win since the year I was born, 1973. Purdue absolutely destroyed Indiana State. Hudson Card set the all-time quarterback efficiency rating at Purdue, and you're talking about a program with 2 already NFL Hall of Famers as alums, and Bob Greasy and Len Dawson, and another one just waiting for eligibility, and Drew Brees. I mean, that's been the best quarterback team historically. I mean, I didn't even mention guys that played in Pro Bowls like Jim Everett and others. That school has put more guys in the NFL at quarterback than any other program in our league. There were just numerous dominant performances by the Big Ten this year, or this opening weekend. And I looked to see one common denominator is they were against FCS teams. On the other hand, though, these are actually fairly highly ranked FCS teams.
A lot of top 20
I mean,
teams.
it was. Yeah, I mean, Iowa beat a ranked FCS team. Illinois did. Purdue beat a team that was getting votes. Weber State, I think, was 26th, or the last team out. Washington absolutely annihilated them. And so, because I don't want to overreact, and typically in my power ratings, I don't even include FCS matchups at all. Like, I don't even consider them at all. All right. I have a theory, or maybe more of a hypothesis. You tell me if it should be upgraded as a theory. All right. That with the transfer portal now, everything operates like a minor league to the Power Four.
Yep.
Okay. And that means everybody moves up a notch, which means the further down you go, the level of play is lower, you know? And I mean, I watched Kate McNamara throw a ball into double coverage against Illinois State. I mean, we couldn't even get him to throw the ball downfield at all at Michigan. We begged him to do it. I mean, he was just check down Charlie. And dude is just winging passes after doing nothing previously, is now just throwing guys open against double coverage. And I want to recognize that, but I'm not sure how much to, because I think maybe the level of play at the FCS level is going to suffer a major drop-off because so many of these guys are getting, basically called up from the minors, for lack of a better analogy. But I also don't want to be unfair because these were some really impressive opening wins, too. You're doing to FCS teams what good football teams are doing. But, I mean, I can't imagine that Indiana played Florida National, but Illinois, Iowa, Washington, all these teams are all that dominant simultaneously. How much of it do you think it really is the caliber of competition they played?
Yeah, I think you're onto something, and it's something I've thought about before, and I think that's definitely happening. Looking in our backyard, we have a couple of FCS teams. Drake is in the Pioneer League, and they actually made the playoffs last year. UNI, though, was kind of our FCS powerhouse here in the state of Iowa, and they were very good for a number of years, and they have dropped off precipitously over the last few years. And correlation, causation, all that, blah, 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 blah. But just to give you an example, David Johnson, he had a couple of really good seasons in the NFL. He came from Northern Iowa. David Johnsons aren't going to happen again. Kurt Warner, really star quarterback at UNI, that type of story, a little bit different, but that's never going to happen again at Northern Iowa. Now, with that being said, with the roster limitations that are coming down the pike for the power teams, meaning that they're capped at 130, something like that, or maybe it's 105, I can't remember, but they're going to be capped. They're all going to be scholarships, all of them scholarships, but no more walk-ons. That could have a positive impact for the lower levels because guys who would normally just take a chance, kind of call their own number, walk on at a place at a high-level university and just take a chance there, well, they're not going to have that option, so they're going to take a scholarship or a partial scholarship at a lower-level team. So I hope that this will kind of even out in the coming years once those roster caps kind of come down the pike. But I think absolutely. You look at a team like Minnesota, they took, was it New Hampshire's quarterback that they took?
Yes. Max Brosner was from New Hampshire.
Yeah. And so that's just an example. Those guys, if they have the opportunities, even if it's for, compared to blue bloods, if they take $250,000, that's going to be $250,000 more dollars than they had playing at FCS New Hampshire or FCS Northern Iowa. I hate that. I think that's getting away, and we've had these conversations. We can have them again all offseason. I hate that, but that's just the reality of the situation. And no, it's not right. No, it's not good for the health of this sport. But I think that's at least part of what we're seeing here. Because I haven't seen across the board this level of domination, except for the game that we're going to talk about next. I haven't seen this level of domination against pretty good, or at least historically good, FCS teams in 1 week, maybe ever.
All right, that brings us to our final game that we want to talk about. And this is one of the weirdest season opening games I can ever remember. And, we're watching over here at my house. I've got some buddies over that are Michigan fans. We're watching Michigan, Fresno State, and they keep showing updates. And you're like, oh, it's early. All right, finally, it's like late third quarter, and Oregon's up on Idaho, FCS Idaho, 17-14. Oregon, a 44-point favorite. Now, this would have surpassed Stanford, USC, and Harbaugh's first year there in 2007 as the biggest point spread upset of all time if Idaho had done the deed, okay? And you keep flipping over there, and you're like, what is going on, And then I looked at the box score after the fact, okay? So here are some things I jotted down here, all right? Oregon had twice as much yardage, had twice the time of possession, won the turnover battle, held Idaho to 2 third-down conversions in the whole game, and 40 yards rushing. Dylan Gabriel was 41 of 48 video game numbers for 400-plus yards, and they almost lost. This game was well within doubt midway through the fourth quarter. I don't have a clue what to make of that. Like, that box score does not align with what was happening in that game on any level. And yeah, Oregon struggled to run the football. A couple of their starting offensive linemen were held back. Fine. But you just those stats alone, given that caliber of opponent. So, a lot of my fellow Michigan fans are like, oh, sure, everybody's all over us for beating a good FBS team by 20, and everybody's going to just, forget that Oregon should have lost to Idaho. But when you look at the stats to this game, they just don't make any sense. I really don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, so in the studio here, they did the BTN football in 60, and so I kind of had glanced up at that a few times during work today. And it was really just a handful of plays where Idaho got really key stops at really key moments and then, it was bad penalties at bad times, missed field goal, things of that nature, and it was just weird. I don't know, man. Now, Dan Lanning was a little pissy after the game, understandably so. Mm-hmm. But do you think after he got into the game film, after he got into the box score a little bit more, isn't this like an awesome situation, though?
Yeah.
You almost lost to an FCS team. They're a top 10 FCS team at that. But you almost lost to an FCS team while playing and looking really good while doing so. That's not a combination of words that should exist, but somehow it happened on Saturday evening. Don't you say this is a big time coaching moment for him where you can really get on your guys, even though you doubled the yardage. You had this massive, you dominated on every area except for the scoreboard. I don't know. If I'm sitting in Dan Lanning's office right now, I'm thinking, boy, this is probably the best case scenario for week one because I can get on these guys' butts really hard. And I also know that we still looked pretty good, just despite the actual final score.
Those old school Oregon unis with the mallard green, those look pretty good too. I like those. All right, we'll come back and we'll play Would You Rather here in a moment. All right, Aaron, it is time to play some Would You Rather here on Bigger 10, and I will let you lead off. So my question to you is this. Would you rather bet Nebraska to cover against Colorado or Illinois to upset Kansas?
See, I don't like the 7.5. I don't like the hook at all. I think it's 7.5, Nebraska against Colorado. I hate that hook because I still think it's going to be close. I mean, say what you want about Coach Prime. His boys and Travis Hunter are talented, just incredible, especially Travis Hunter. That catch I don't know if you saw that catch that he made for a touchdown on Thursday. That's just obscene. So they have the tools to keep themselves in games, at least early in the season. And Nebraska still has to show me that they can not only sit on you, but stay sitting on you once they got the lead. And they still have to show me that. They looked really good last week, but they got to show me that. So I'm not confident, and I'm not picking Illinois to win. I've got Kansas tomorrow on confidence picks. But in terms of betting, I would rather actually bet Illinois to upset Kansas than just because of that hook, Nebraska to cover against Colorado. All right, this one is for you. Would you rather your favorite team put, quote, a lot of stuff on film week 1 or, quote, not show very much for future opponents? This is one of the stupidest talking points in week 1, and I get it. Like you said on Michigan podcast, we don't have a preseason. All we can do is overreact to week 1. But this is one of the most mind-numbing. This is up there with week 1 of the preseason in the NFL. The ref, trips over a pigeon on the field. Well, it's preseason for the refs too. This is one of the talking points. Oh, you don't want to put very much on film for your team, or if you show a lot of your playbook, oh, they're putting a lot of stuff on film. Make the opposition think about a lot of stuff when they're preparing for you next week. Which of these would you like, though? Would you rather not put very much on film, or would you rather put a bunch of stuff on film?
I really think it depends on your situation. I mean, so let me since I'll go with the team I know the best. All right. So last year for Michigan, our season was just never going to begin until that Penn State game on the road. So I actually think you put everything on film right away that you can, because that's 9 games into the season. And you want to know that you can actually run that stuff, right? You want guys to have known they can actually do some of that stuff. And you're so talented in that case, as we were a year ago, and so deep, and you get a top 10 pick at quarterback, that it's really not so much about the element of surprise as much as it is about execution at that point. For Michigan this year, though, and I'll answer it in this context, I would much rather you put you held some things back, because your schedule ramps up week 2. Now, I would have liked to have seen them show a little bit more. I cannot believe we didn't run one play action pass under center with a new quarterback, but that's been a staple of Michigan offenses since before I was born. So be confident that you're going to see that on Saturday against Texas. But in this case, or in Iowa's case with Iowa State on deck after an FCS team, or in Illinois' case with Kansas on deck after an FCS team, or in Tennessee's case with an FCS team with NC State on deck this weekend, and so on and so forth. In that case, I do think it is wise to hold some things back, particularly if in Tennessee's case, Michigan's case, you have a new starting quarterback. And so those are things that the opponent really doesn't know, what routes yet is he the most comfortable throwing, so we can roll our coverages that way. I do think there's some strategic advantage there if we're talking about the fact you have a major opponent in week 2. And I'll give you some data to back this up. One of the great tropes of college football is that there's always an advantage if one team has a game in hand over the other team, right? Well, since 2018, teams that played a game against teams that did not play a game to open the season have only covered 45% of the time. It's 55-45 the other way. Why? Well, because you already played. You put some stuff on film. We know some things that you guys don't know about us. So I do think if you're playing a big-time opponent in week 2, as Michigan is, then I would hold some things back. As Iowa is, as Illinois is, as Tennessee is, then I would hold some things back. If you're not doing that, then, man, I'd much rather a team is getting good at what they want to do for games that are going to really matter later on.
Interesting. Okay.
All right. For you, would you rather bet Iowa State over the total or Michigan money line against Texas?
Man, the look ahead for Michigan versus Texas was like Texas 2.5, 3.5, something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 3.5.
Now it's up to a touchdown or over a touchdown last time.
7.5 now.
7.5.
Yeah.
I'd rather take Iowa State over. If this was even happening in 4 or 5 weeks, once Davis Warren got a few more games under his belt, I might answer a little bit differently, but I think the chances, that 35.5 is still a really low total. Mm-hmm. There can be multiple wonky things that happen in a game that can get you pretty close to that total by itself. 2
of Iowa State's best linebackers are going to be out, and I was going to roll those tight ends at him in the passing game. Yeah.
So I would rather go over the total, Iowa versus Iowa State. Finally, for you, coming off of 2 statement wins, would you rather bet USC or Penn State at this point to win the Big Ten?
Oh, without question, Penn State, they still have the much more fortuitous schedule. They do not play Michigan. They get Ohio State at home, and they don't play Oregon. I mean, they had one of the more fortuitous schedules even before we saw that performance. So, I mean, USC has to still play at Michigan. They do host Penn State. So that game's a lot bigger now. That was kind of just going to be a game heading into the year. We thought that was just a game that sounded great, but now there's a lot more riding on that. But I mean, USC's schedule throughout the course of the season is much tougher. I mean, if it weren't for Florida and maybe playing the most ridiculous schedule in the history of college football, I think Bill Connolly's day projections at SP Plus, he took all of the teams in his top 5 and in his power ratings and ran them through Florida's schedule, and the average finish of those top 5 teams against Florida's schedule was 9-3 of his top 5 teams.
Wow.
So that's Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama. Okay. So Florida's schedule this year is maybe the toughest in modern college football history. But if it weren't for that outlier, USC's schedule would be in the conversation for sure. So if you're going to give me Penn State with that fortuitous schedule and now an explosive offense, I'd much rather bet them to win the Big Ten.
Yeah, your schedule becomes much more difficult when it seems like your team is already checked out middle of week 1. I mean, did it look like to you Florida versus Miami was even a game? It would just look like nobody from Florida even wanted to be there.
I'll tell you what, if you subscribe to us on Patreon, I recommended before the season Cam Ward plus 1,800 to win the Heisman. That was one of my futures bets. He's down to plus 700 after last week, which is still a good bet, by the way, but not nearly as good as plus 1,800 is. So, all right, let's come back and we will wrap things up with our X-Poll results and feedback of the week here when we do. All right, this week's X-Poll results. What's the biggest overreaction to week 1? 39% of you said Iowa's offense being legit. 25% of you say Oregon being way overrated. 23% saying Penn State is the Big Ten's best. Only 13% of you said Michigan doesn't have a quarterback is the biggest overreaction. I think of all the things on this list, that is the least overreaction, actually. Hope I'm wrong, but if I'm not, just remember, we won the Natty. Aaron, that brings us to our feedback of the week from Tom, who says, what a surprise. People are overrating Penn State again. I get it, Tom. I mean, we went through this 2 years ago, and they went down and beat an Auburn team on the road in disarray and looked impressive doing so. They were great against West Virginia in the rain to open the year a year ago. I'm just telling you, though, Sean Clifford down on the plains in Alabama and Drew Aller last year at home did not look like Drew Aller last week in Morgantown. That was not the same guy. That was not the same system. Okay, so. But hey, I don't blame anybody if you're like, come back to me when you guys beat Michigan or Ohio State again. I don't blame anybody for having that take. Penn State's kind of where Michigan was, with Harbaugh in 2018, 2019 or so. Are you ever going to get over the hump? And, I thought we never would. And, then we became the hump, all right, the measuring stick of the Big Ten. So, but if I were, I try to always look at things when I analyze teams that I don't root for. What would I say about them if I did? And then what would they say about my team if they didn't? Right. And if I'm a Penn State fan, I don't know how I'm not excited about that opening showing.
Agreed. There's you at least have to have some optimism there because it does look different. It does look different. Much different level of competition, obviously, but there are some things about Iowa this week that looked different. Just a quarterback who can make what are hard throws, but throws that need to be made to look easy at this level. Those were there, at least in the second half. There were some throws, wide open receivers. Drew Aller just looked, I'm never going to pronounce his last name correctly, ever.
Just go with all of them. You'll eventually get it right.
Exactly. I'm never going to do it. I've just convinced myself. But he looked confident. He looked comfortable. He was throwing the ball down the field. Yes, he needs to do that against even tougher competition. But Morgantown's pretty tough. It's a pretty tough place to play. And he passed the first test. So you got to at least have some optimism now.
No doubt about that. All right, that's going to do it here for this week's edition of Bigger 10. Don't forget to like, rate, subscribe, share, 5-star review, whether you're watching here on YouTube, listening on iTunes, or elsewhere. Those things, when you do those things, helps us to find, helps the algorithms to locate more Big Ten fans and direct them to the show that are just like you, and we would appreciate that. You can also follow us on Game Day for our instant real-time takes on Big Ten action, some big games in our league this week, and we've, of course, got all kinds of takes in between episodes on X as well. Follow us there at Bigger10, at Bigger10 on X. For Aaron McIntyre, I'm Steve Dace. We'll see you here next week on Bigger 10.